We are here today to talk about one of the most interesting positions to scout. That's tight end. It's so interesting. It's so difficult to scout, if I'm being honest, because it's one thing you learn when you start really just focusing on a college tight end is that 90% of college tight ends have no idea what their job is on a lot of plays and are just kind of
1,000%.
figuring it out.
Yeah, they're out there, right? Like they're there. They're like, I think I'm supposed to catch a pass on this play. I think I'm supposed to run block on this play. Maybe I'm supposed to do this on this play. You get a couple of guys that you're like, oh, he knew what he was doing there. But overall, I agree with you, Q. It's a very mysterious position, especially at the collegiate level.
With the way basketball has changed, and this is a football podcast, but with the way that the power forward has really kind of been squeezed out of basketball, it has created a lot more freak athletes at the perfect tight end size. Like college power forwards growing up, you had guys who were 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", 6'7", who were playing power forward, who really didn't have a shot at the NBA, but they were really good college power forwards.
Yep.
Those guys are largely NFL or college football tight ends now. So you're getting some of those really freakish athletes playing college football at the tight end position. So you're getting more of those guys who just, again, have no idea what their job is out there or what they're doing or why they're doing it. They're still really figuring out the pace of the game because they probably played basketball for a lot of their life until, they stopped growing and realized they weren't going to be 6'9", 6'10 plus.
Yeah.
Who made the switch to football late. And I feel like that's a lot of what we see in the tight end prospects the last few years.
That is such a beautiful analogy and just analysis, Q, because that's something I admittedly didn't even think about. And you're right. You're 100% right? We can talk to all of our friends over at Bulls on Tap, and they'll tell you, like, the old school power forward is a very different position now, even in today's NBA, let alone in college basketball. You are starting to see a lot of these guys that are freak of nature, athletes that are big. And when it translates over, I mean, how many times, Q, have people been like, oh, LeBron James would be such a good tight end in the NFL, right? Like, basketball player and tight end is like synonymous when you cross these two sports. And it's analysis I didn't think about, Q. That's a good one. And that's a hell of a point because we're going to talk about a lot of those type of guys here tonight.
Opening this thing up beyond, the basketball talk, we always want to start these shows talking about what do the Bears have at this position currently. So we look at this. We have Cole Kmet on the roster, really the only NFL tight end that you have on the roster. And you just gave him a nice fat extension. His cap hit next year is 12 or 11.6 million. So you're locked into that for the next few years at least. Like, so his extension runs through 2027. There is an out after this year, surprisingly. And then after, it's actually a really easy contract to get out of. Next year, the dead cap's only 4.8 million, and it only goes down from there. So you're not stuck with it, but I think Cole Kmet's a good guy to have on that contract. Honestly, the cap hit never exceeds 11.6 million, so it's just a flat cap hit all 4 years. And as long as he stays healthy, I don't think there's going to be much reason to move on from that contract unless you just find a really great deal. But even then, I think having two tight ends, assuming that Shane Waldron is your OC, you're happy with that too.
100%. I think we've become accustomed to, as Bears fans watching from afar, of the Seattle Seahawks being a team that's typically run that two tight end personnel. They're not afraid to have two tight ends on the field at the same time. And they do it quite often. I mean, they made a success at it for how many years of running a very similar offense. So I think it always makes sense to have two at least solid tight ends on the roster. I think in today's NFL, even with, the more spread out scheme and things like that, tight ends are becoming such athletes that having two of them on your roster, it just creates mismatch opportunities, right? Because you see these linebackers in today's day. We'll do a little position crossover here, Q. Linebackers are becoming so much smaller. So if you have these humongous tight ends, you force a team to either drop a safety to cover him one-on-one, or you are forcing a linebacker who might just be physically outmatched by one of these tight ends to be at a disadvantage on any given coverage play. And I think that's where the tight end position still has a ton of just valuable, it's entirely valuable still in football. I don't think it's going to get phased out anytime soon. But you do see this notion, right, of like the inline guy versus the move around tight end, and like depending on the offense, right, it's the Y versus the U, and depending on what that and kind of coaches speak is. But I think having two guys that can play both in line is never a bad thing. And maybe even you have three of them on the roster if you're really deep at the position. Obviously, very few teams are like that. So I agree with you. I think having Cole Kmet on the roster is great. He can be that Y tight end that's in line and you're not concerned about him. He might not be the greatest blocker in the world, but he's still a good enough blocker where playing him in line as the Y makes plenty of sense. But you can also move him.
As far as tight ends go, he's probably one of the more solid blockers in the league.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as guys who you feel like are a threat to catch the football too.
Yes.
I'm not sure there's many guys who you feel a lot better about as a blocker. I'm not saying that I think he's an amazing blocker, but I think he's well above average for the position because
absolutely
not many tight ends are actually that good at blockers.
Right, because now it's such a receiving position in the NFL. So I agree with you. I think Cole Kmet is truly the perfect tight end to have on this roster, especially given what Waldron has done in Seattle, what the offenses he's come from have done historically, whether that was the Rams with McVay. You see them run a lot of two tight end personnel. They're not afraid to do it. And then the Seahawks did it at I don't want to use the term alarming rate by any means. The tight end position consistently evolving. I'm right there with you. I think from the tight end perspective, like Cole Kmet is the perfect tight end to already have on this Bears roster, but I do think they absolutely can add at this position. I don't think it's going to be in a round where you probably want them to go receiver or edge rusher, kind of like you and I talked about in the pre-show. But I definitely think there is room to improve this tight end room because, like you said, Cole Kmet really the only true NFL tight end right now currently on the roster and under contract.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe they might address something in free agency. I mean, a guy like Colby Parkinson was in Seattle last year with Waldron. He's more of a blocking tight end. A guy like Noah Fant was
Didn't they release Disley too?
They might have. I didn't catch it.
They're releasing Disley. I thought I saw that too. And another guy that was just in Seattle is that Y tight end last year. So
yeah,
you could maybe see him make an impact too. But don't mean to cut you off. Continue.
Yeah, no, I personally think that if you see them add someone, you're going to have a few options if you want to find a more move tight end guy like Noah Fant, Gerald Everett, maybe Adam Troutman might be able to fill that for you, or Mike Gesicki. But I honestly think it makes more sense to go after a move guy in the draft, like in later rounds, and then add a guy like Parkinson as your blocker tight end, who also, is serviceable as a pass catcher. And, he could probably fill in that role, or like an Austin Hooper maybe could fill a role like that, as he's probably a better blocker than receiver at this point in his career, but you're also comfortable with him as a receiver. So they do have options to add in free agency. I would expect them to add one free agent tight end, one rookie, but there's also, these are some of the better free agent targets. They could go after a guy like a Irv Smith or Charlie Werner. I mean, your third tight end on the roster, or second tight end even, isn't usually a marquee name, so I wouldn't get my hopes up too much for a big name there. I think Noah Fant might get a chance to start somewhere, and he's probably going to take that over, taking backup money in a backup role.
100%. I agree. It's if they do add via free agency, I do think it's more of that depth tight end signing if they do make it. But again, I think you and I are going to highlight it here today, Q. Like there's a number of guys that second, fourth round pick that they have, if they end up moving back and are able to obtain additional draft capital, they could certainly utilize some of that, maybe even in somewhere like the fifth round. Obviously, they traded their fifth round pick for Ryan Bates, which is big news since the last time Bears on Tap has been live. So, they're down to minimal draft capital. They're going to have to move back if you're probably going to get somebody in like the fifth round. But again, 2 fourth round picks. And I think a lot of these guys make sense right in that wheelhouse of where we're going to talk about today, Q.
Yeah, I think by moving that fifth round pick, I mean, it's little, it's a fifth round pick, but I think it does signal a little bit their intentions here, that they're planning to get more draft capital in multiple ways. Some of that's a potential Justin Fields trade. Some of that might be moving down from 9, but I do think they intend to add more draft capital, just because it feels out of character for Poles to be going into the draft as low on draft capital, or low on pick volume, I should say, because the draft capital is still really high when you have 2 picks.